Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. The president is running for re-election. He is at his first 2020 campaign fundraiser. No president has ever had one so early in his first term. In fact, both Presidents Obama and George W. Bush waited until the third year of their presidencies before even filing for re-election. At least part of the reason for holding the event, according to one Republican affiliated with the Trump campaign, is to, quote, help show that he is not going anywhere. It's happening at his own hotel in Washington, which he and his family still have a financial stake in, which we'll talk about shortly with the former ethics advisor to President George W. Bush. And contrary to what the White House promised as recently as this afternoon, tonight's event is now taking place entirely behind closed doors, no reporters, no cameras. Just as there were no cameras again today at the White House press briefing, just as the GOP Senate health care bill was drafted and is being redrafted in secret, we have no reporting on that tonight, including the big surprise the president is promising. We have exclusive reporting on frustration inside the White House that the president seems almost in denial about the Russian threat to the next elections, lest it throw doubt on his 2016 victory. So a big night of news ahead. It starts outside the Trump International Hotel in Washington with CNN's Caitlin Collins. So talk about what's going on at this event behind you and why it's closed to the press now all of a sudden.
Yeah, you'll have to excuse me. There's a lot of noise around here right now because of the protesters who are outside Trump Hotel while the president is inside delivering remarks to donors right now. Now, the event is closed to the press. That has been much debated today. We started out this morning with the event being closed to the press. And when Sarah Sanders, the deputy press secretary, was pushed on this during the off-camera gaggle today, she said it was because this is a political event and they were keeping it separate. But then with some prodding from the press, they decided to allow a few pen and pad reporters in and one camera, and then 2 hours later they changed their minds. So there is no press inside this event right now. We have no idea what the president is saying to his donors, and we will likely won't find out unless one of the donors tells us.
How much, if anything, is the Trump Hotel getting paid to host this event? Do we know? I know you were asking some questions about that.
That's a great question. We have no idea who is paying for this event tonight that the president is attending. We've reached out for comment, and our requests have not been answered. So it could be the RNC, it could be the re-election campaign, and it could be that the hotel donated this space. We don't know.
Is it normal for a president to hold a fundraiser for his re-election only 5 months after taking office? We mentioned that, I mean, Presidents Obama and George W. Bush, they didn't do it for another 2 years.
Yeah, we were campaigning in 2017 for the 2020 election, even though Donald Trump was just inaugurated not very far from where I'm standing right now, less than 6 months ago. This is the earliest we've ever seen a president hold a re-election fundraiser, and the president's getting started early. But for Donald Trump, it's like the campaign never ended. He's held 5 rallies since he took office in January, and all of those have been in states where he won. And we know how Donald Trump is at his rallies. He loves, the crowds and the chants and whatnot.
Do you think in terms of doing something?
I think it would help enormously. There's so much that has to be done. You have to raise the defense of this country, and that's complicated because it's our states and local authorities who run the elections, so you have to have that dialogue, a federal, local, state dialogue, number one. Number two, you want to send a stiff message to the Russian Federation that we're not going to tolerate this kind of attack on our own country, and that there will be retribution. You want to work with the Europeans to tighten up what the NATO alliance can do. You want to try to prosecute hackers, find them and prosecute them if the Russian government is subcontracting this to some of the private hacking organizations in that country. There's so much that has to be done. This should have been the first executive order signed on January 20th. They ought to think about forming even a 9/11 type commission, because there's nothing more important that the American people have confidence in their votes when they go to the ballot box, either for the midterm elections in 2018 or the next presidential election in 2020.
Ambassador Burns, Jim Sciutto, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Coming up next, the president is promising a big surprise on the Obamacare replacement bill. We're going to look at what it might be, as well as his habit of telling us to stay tuned for something and then not necessarily delivering. We'll keep him honest on that next.
New details tonight on the Senate Intelligence Committee's probe into Trump campaign associates' contacts with Russians. This is the top Republican of the Senate Intelligence Committee seemingly contradicting the President of the United States. Manu Raju is out front on Capitol Hill. And Manu, Trump and his team obviously public about there being no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians. You just spoke to the Republican chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Do those public statements reflect reality?
Not quite, Aaron. In fact, the jury is still out for Richard Burr, the chairman of that committee, saying that the committee has, in fact, interviewed more than 40 witnesses so far and says that the issue of collusion is something that they are still chasing, something they're trying to determine at this point in their investigation. Take a listen.
Well, I would only say that there have been public comments that suggest that there's been no overwhelming evidence to suggest that there was collusion, but we have to chase down every potential pathway that we see. When we conclude all those, we'll make a final report.
Now, Aaron, I followed up and said, well, have you seen anything that suggests collusion from what you've seen so far? And he said, quote, it's not for me to judge, a sign that this is an area still that the committee is digging in closely. One reason why they're trying to bring in these Trump associates. And now, Aaron, also tonight, we're learning that Richard Burr did have a conversation with Bob Mueller, the special counsel. And Richard Burr believes that he's going to get actually see that memo that fired FBI Director James Comey wrote about his interactions with President Trump. This is something that Congress has been demanding but has not seen yet, Aaron.
And Manu, of course, that also reflects what the Democratic ranking member, of course, in the committee, Mark Warner, said last night to us. He said collusion is still very much at the heart of this, that the jury is out. And I know you, Manu, have some more information about some of those Trump associates who are now going to testify before Congress, because I think a big part of this people may not realize is a lot of these folks have not yet testified.
Yeah, that's right. And the big names, including Carter Page, Paul Manafort, of course, Michael Flynn. What we're learning tonight, Aaron, is that J.D. Gordon, who was a national security advisor for the Trump campaign, actually was scheduled to be interviewed in a classified session today before the House Intelligence Committee. But that was abruptly canceled because of a scheduling conflict. They do believe Gordon was telling me earlier today that he's more than willing to answer questions. He said he did nothing wrong, only had a couple of conversations with the Russian ambassador. But all these are moving behind closed doors as the committee is trying to interview these so-called eyewitnesses that they could actually probe a little bit deeper about what happened, including Roger Stone, who's of course, the Trump advisor. July 24th is when he's going to go behind closed doors and talk to the House Intelligence Committee. But of course, Aaron, he wanted to talk in public. That's something the committee will not let him do, Aaron.
All right. Thank you very much, Manu. All right, and now senior political analyst Mark Preston joins me, along with the Washington bureau chief for the Daily Beast, Jackie Kucinich. Mark, President Trump and his aides obviously have insisted repeatedly there's no collusion, never was any collusion, it's a hoax. But you just heard Senator Burr. He says it's too early to make that call. How significant is it that the top Republican, right, chairman of the Senate Intel Committee, seems to be contradicting the president?
Well, it's very significant for two very simple reasons, though, Aaron. The first is, does Richard Burr want to use a lot of his time, probably a majority of his time right now, to be looking into a Republican president to see if he's done any wrongdoing? He doesn't necessarily want to do it, but obviously he feels compelled that he has to do it because that is his job. Secondly, it's also a member of his own party, and could you imagine if he was able to actually uncover collusion on behalf of somebody who was associated with Trump? That would not necessarily help his political party. So the fact that he hasn't taken it off the table does say something.
It does say something, Jackie. I mean, you know, and what I think is also important here, and Manu and I were referencing this, right, is there's bipartisan agreement on this, right? You just heard Burr. The ranking Democrat on the committee, though, last night Mark Warner was here. I just referenced what he said. Let me just play it for you. Just to be clear, when it comes to the collusion issue specifically, Senator, in your view, this is still very much an open area of investigation.
This is, in a sense, the heart of the investigation.
Obviously, Jackie, he seems to be very much on the same page as Senator Burr.
And these two have been on the same page from the get-go. When the House was still going through their pains, you turn to the Senate and you would see that there was actually something going on. But I think what both of these men are saying, and what Manu is saying, and what you're saying, and what Preston is saying, is this is still very early. As much as the Trump administration wants to say that this has been going on forever and everyone's just running in circles, that's not the case. This is something that is going to continue to go on, whether or not they like it, both in the Congress and outside with the other investigations that are going on.
And I think, Mark, it's important to point out here, right, that when, it seems like this has been going on for a long time, and in many ways it has, right? But when you're looking at, let's just say, the Senate Intelligence Committee, right, they're quick to say, look, this has been going on for about 4 months.
Right.
They themselves have interviewed a lot of people, but none of the central players who were related to Trump. Right? They have not yet. This kind of feeling of it's all done and we just need to kind of put a seal on it is inaccurate.
Absolutely. The fact is, and the three major players have not even testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee, right? General Flynn, Paul Manafort, and Carter Page. Those are the three, quite frankly, where everyone is focusing on. It's not necessarily President Trump when you're talking about collusion. You're talking about three specific people who still haven't testified, and it's those three people, Aaron. And let me just take the liberty and say this. A lot of people don't believe this, but I can't imagine that the three of us or most Americans want there to be a finding that there was collusion that affected our elections. Because in the end, I mean, we are all Americans. And when we see this division on this issue, it really is disheartening.
I mean, Jackie, look, it's not just once. It's not just twice. But Trump has tried to argue there was no collusion. It has been multiple occasions. Okay, here he is in his own words.
There is no collusion between me and my campaign and the Russians. Everybody said the same thing. They say there's no collusion.
Get it out of the White House.
They're all saying there is no collusion. There is no collusion.
Precisely.
Well, I'd like it to move fast, if possible, but I'll tell you what I really want. There is no collusion. We have nothing to do with Russia.
There has been no obstruction. There has been no collusion. There has been leaking by Comey. But there's been no collusion, no obstruction, and virtually everybody agrees to that.
I mean, Jackie, obviously you heard him there. Everyone's convinced. They say there's no collusion. Obviously, that's exactly what Senator Burr is saying. He's absolutely not willing to say at this point.
Well, right. And again, it's because the investigation isn't even, it's just started in a lot of ways. And, this is one of the things that the president kind of got himself in trouble, or it seems like he got himself in trouble, for trying to get various officials like Comey, like Admiral Rogers, like other officials to say this publicly, and they weren't willing to do that. So again, he wants it's understandable that he'd want a quick resolution to this, but they're just not there yet. These investigations aren't there yet.
All right, thank you both very much. And next, we're going to take you live. The first Trump re-election fundraiser at the Trump International Hotel, 40 months before Election Day. Who's paying his hotel for the $35,000 a plate event? And why can't Donald Trump, the deal maker, seal a deal for a bill to pass Congress?
Most trusted name in news.
Breaking news. President Trump, as you see, just arriving at his first re-election fundraiser in Washington at the Trump International Hotel. It's a top dollar affair. The minimum just to be there is $35,000 a plate. It was supposed to be open to press. In fact, it was throughout most of the day. About an hour ago, then banned, no press allowed. Caitlin Collins is out front at the Trump International Hotel with more. And Caitlin, who exactly is paying for this?
That's a great question, Aaron. The President of the United States is holding his first campaign fundraiser for his 2020 campaign tonight at his hotel in Washington behind me, and the American people have no idea who is paying for it. Though we have asked multiple times who is, we don't know if it's the RNC, if it's the 2020 campaign, or if the hotel donated this space. We just don't know. Our requests for answers have not been answered. Now, this is an event where the press has largely been shut out. At first, it was a closed event, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the deputy press secretary, justified that today at the off-camera briefing by saying that was because it was a political event and they wanted to keep it separate. But after there was some prodding from the media, they decided to open it up to a few pen and pad reporters and one camera. Then 2 hours later, they changed their minds again, and now no press is being allowed in at this event for the president where he is delivering remarks tonight. Now, this isn't that surprising because the president has increasingly distanced himself from the press in recent days. There have been very few on-camera briefings, and they haven't taken any questions at press conferences when foreign leaders are in town.
All right. Thank you very much, Caitlin. And as you heard Caitlin saying, a lot of questions without answers. With more now, Larry Noble, General Counsel at the Campaign Legal Center.